But yeah, whenever you feel comfortable, we can start. But yeah, make sure it's just as close as possible, and
Okay.
inshallah we get started. But
Everyone's got their phone off, like the silent.
you can leave it, or it's fine. Make it
okay.
more authentic.
Oh,
If someone
okay.
calls, you know.
I understand. I get it.
But yeah, like in terms of, I guess, your background, I saw some of your videos as well.
Yeah.
Online, you did one with, as I just mean, like Hamza Tsortsis and people, the guys from Islam 21C and stuff like that. So obviously you've done a lot of, the Uyghur activism around the world. So how's that been for yourself? Like, can you walk us through your experiences and maybe a bit of your background? Because yeah, as we were talking, like, said in your bio, Bahrain, you're residing there, but you're in Australia now.
Yeah.
But then Mukhlis is telling me you're in US, so it's a bit of a mixed bag going on.
Yes, so the bio you sort of got is sort of a year old.
Yeah.
I recently moved to the US. I've remarried, so my wife is there, alhamdulillah. And inshallah, the
whereabouts
work we'll be
in
doing.
US?
So in DC.
DC.
So I'm literally like 10 minutes walk from the Pentagon, like right in the center, which can be sort of it can be sort of strange because, like in Australia, you don't have many masajid over there. So what happens is sometimes I like to go walking, if it's time for Asr, right? Because I always got my prayer mat with me. So I'm like literally praying around like sort of secure areas. I get sort of looks because I got my beard and everything. So alhamdulillah, it's good though. Yeah.
Do you know Dr. Jonathan Brown? I think he lives in DC area as well. You guys mates, by any chance?
Dr. Johnson Brown, no. I mean, probably if I see him, I know who he is, but I don't know.
Okay, no,
I've never heard of him. Sorry.
I'm just trying to think of Muslims that live around that area as well. But yeah, in terms of like, I think so. You grew up in Sydney, right?
Yeah, I was born and raised. I was born in Liverpool Hospital.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I live in Liverpool as well.
Yeah, I went to high school in Bonnerick, and then I went to Kingswood, UWS. I don't know what it is, Australian Western Sydney.
It's WSU now.
WSU, but back in like 10 years ago, it was like UWS.
Oh, okay. And what did you study?
So actually, I did a bachelor's of music.
Oh,
yeah. So
nice.
I'm like a high school music teacher, and then
nice.
So then, not too long after that, I moved to Istanbul and I was there from 2011 to 2018-19. I was doing mainly English teaching there, and then I went to Bahrain for 2 years as well to do sort of English teaching. And then it was about the time I was sort of practicing as well. So when I first went to Istanbul, you hear the adhan and you see all the halal food. You're like, you want to make hijrah, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so that was the sort of thing. And so alhamdulillah, so I was there for a bit, and yeah. But, they got their own sort of economic and political turmoil there, so it couldn't really stay there for too long, yeah. So.
And so you came back to
and then I sort of went through some personal things, and then I sort of had to go to Bahrain and things like that. And then, I had to go somewhere. I couldn't get into Australia because of the lockdown and how strict that was the main thing. So I needed to sort of, sort of hold off, had to be somewhere. I was one of those Australians in the news, the stranded Australians. Oh. So that in and of itself. So like I of myself had never gone through any sort of like refugee sort of plight, but in that time, I sort of felt that, you had no way, you couldn't go back to your own country. It was very strict, and it was the first time I sort of felt like a Uyghur, not knowing where to go. Obviously, we can't compare, but still, like not being able to go back to your country, you're sort of left stranded, and well, which is what many Uyghurs are going through today, especially in places like Turkey and some in the Middle East as well.
Can you maybe share with you sort of the stories that you may have heard in terms of what you just mentioned, in terms of potentially in Turkey and other places?
Yeah, so the issue is technically on paper, the Uyghurs today are Chinese citizens, right, on paper. But China themselves especially today, don't recognize them as Chinese citizens, or they're classed as second or third class citizens. So the way that Uyghurs, especially in places like Turkey or the Middle East, end up as refugees is that you are not able to renew your passport. So when you go to the Chinese consulate, you rock up and then you apply like you're applying to renew your Chinese passport. And then they end up giving you a travel document saying you can go and get your Chinese passport, but you have to go all the way back to, your homeland. Or they say what is defined as a homeland is Xinjiang. Okay, so you have to go there and you renew it there. And obviously, people avoid going back there because as soon as you do, you are taken to, you're imprisoned, you're taken to a concentration camp. And one of the reasons, you're taken is because you've been overseas, you've been to a place like Turkey. Legally, you went there. You went there with a Chinese passport. It was all legal. It was good to go. And then suddenly they said you're not allowed to go anymore. So what I mean by that is there were things that you could do before that suddenly you're being called up on. So there was probably a book that you said you talked about Uyghur pride or the Uyghur nation, or you talked about something Islamic, or you named your child Aisha. Or you had a beard, or you had a hijab. And these were things that were sort of legal back in the day. No one really caught up on it, but only now they're clamping down on those things.
Oh, sorry, what do you mean by back in the day?
Back in the day, I'm talking about, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It was still restricted. And they would only sort of, for example, if we're talking Islamically, they would only go for the ones that opened up underground mosques.
Okay.
Or they were propagating to Islam, these sorts of people that were locking up. So it was generally okay if you practiced, as long as you were not like a star, like your Muhammad hijab types in society or Hamza Torti, as long as you didn't get to that level where you were influencing people. So it's sort of similar to, you may have heard of the Falun Gong movement.
Yeah.
So the Falun Gong movement back in the day, which is like 20, 30 years ago, when it first started, it was okay. It's in a spiritual, Buddhist-y type movement, but when it started to get like 100, it ended up having like 150 million members, which is more than the Communist Party, then they started clamping down on it. So they don't want any sort of movement that you have, they don't want anyone too influential. And that goes for any area, not just Islam, Falun Gong, in Christianity, Judaism, any sort of movement, regardless whether it's Abrahamic religions or New Age religions. If you're too influential, you are, taken away, basically. You are made to be silent.
Okay, so about like 10 years ago, things were like calmer than it is now. When did it really start to change?
So around 2014, 15-ish, you started getting people locked up around. So the first thing that happened was there is something in China called hukou, right? It's like a domestic passport that you have. So that would mean we live in Sydney, yeah? So you would need a special passport if you wanted to go to Goulburn. Like you would have to change, or let's just say you wanted to move to Adelaide, you couldn't. It would be very difficult to move to Adelaide. You're working with like a passport. So you had many people within what we refer to as our homeland, East Turkistan, moving from city to city. So the main city or the capital city today is Urumqi. Yeah. So you had many people coming from the south and the north, moving into Urumqi for trade and whatever. But they moved there, they bought houses and they rented places, but they didn't have a hukou. They weren't able to move their residence permit to there. So they suddenly made a law saying everyone has to go back to wherever their hukou or their domestic passport is. So they did that first. Secondly, they started out branding all the men. So anyone that was praying, anyone that was sort of influential in society, they started rounding those people up. How do they know that you're praying? You may have heard of China's mass surveillance. They started to, just like we've recently seen QR codes in Sydney because of Corona, you had to sort of scan your ID every time you went into the mosque. And so before they said, we years ago, like 10 years ago, they said they were doing this for security reasons. And suddenly we found out that they were going to use it, that they were using it for this. So if you ended up going to the mosque or you were found to be practicing, and you have something also in the neighborhoods, like voluntary police or voluntary spies or voluntary reporters, and people essentially report on each other. And if they don't build a certain quota, they themselves get in trouble. So it's through things like this where people started being rounded up. And there were then you had a second round of people. It was just like whatever, people that didn't even know about Islam or not necessarily influential. If you had Uyghur on your ID, you were sent in. So in Australia, on all our IDs and our driver's licenses, it doesn't say what our background is. It doesn't say on mine I'm Uyghur or you're Chinese, or I'm not sure, brother, what your background is. It doesn't say like Bangladeshi origin. It doesn't say that. It's just you're Australian. That's it. Khalas, right? Even on our passports. But in China, it says what minzu you are.
Yeah.
If you're
What minority?
what minority you are. So through that, they were rounding up all the Uyghurs. Then they're doing the Kazakhs. Then they started doing the Hui Muslims. Then they started doing all these other groups. But the most predominantly targeted group was the Uyghurs, or is the Uyghurs.
Can I
right
just
now.
ask a question on that? Because like when I was doing sort of my research, can correct me if I'm wrong, but apparently like that was made in order to identify the minorities as a in the sense of positive discrimination, where, for example, they might like allow you to get into university, and even here HSC, I think they give you extra like ATA points if you're from Aboriginal background and that sort of thing. So apparently like in China it was a similar thing where they were using that. So maybe you can correct my misunderstanding something, but they did that for that reason as well. That's what they claim.
So on paper, that's what it says. But in practice, it doesn't say that. So for example, I'll give you an example where this happens a lot. So they'll actually, when you actually talk to Uyghur students that have been through the process of examinations or job applications, they'll say straight to your face, I'm sorry, you're a Uyghur. Like there are some honest Chinese businessmen out there. They're like, look, I got a quota. I can't have you. I can only, it's the opposite actually. Like I'm only supposed to have this amount of Uyghurs and I'm supposed to get this many Han Chinese on board. They'll say it to your face. On paper, for example, on paper, it says there's freedom of religion in China. Yeah. On paper, you're allowed to gather and protest peacefully. On paper, it says a lot of things, but in practice, there's no law in China. So for example, I'll give you a practical reason today. So on paper, you're only allowed to be, if you're a Chinese citizen, you can only be of one citizen. You can't be dual citizen. But today you'll see, for example, in the Olympics, you've got some American-born Chinese who are competing for China, but they've turned the law around them for them. So they're allowed to be, so those sorts of people are allowed to be dual citizens, Eileen Gu and the sort. Right, yeah. So we say there is no law when it comes to China. That they always change and make up their own laws. So for example, you're not allowed to use, so for example, there's no social media in China, meaning there's no Facebook, Instagram, Twitter.
Like they have their own social media.
Yeah, they have their own social media, right? But you'll see their own Chinese diplomats, their own Chinese influencers, their own people who talk or promote China, use VPNs and get on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. But that in itself, using a VPN is a crime. And if you're using it in East Turkestan, it is classed as like a second-degree terrorism. You're going against a terrorism law. So there's no law in China, we say.
So I was in China almost 10 years ago, and it was very lax with VPNs. Like everyone was using them, and so like, is this sort of I suppose strictness been something like I suppose recently in the last 5 years or something like that?
Yeah, definitely. Even whether you're in the East or in the West, you've seen Chinese netizens or Chinese YouTubers, they themselves be persecuted. So the funniest thing happened, right? There is, I forget his name now, but there is a Taiwanese YouTuber, talking big about Taiwan and, how good it is and bagging out the Communist Party. So this, there was a Chinese mainlander, a nationalistic, wanting to do good for the Chinese Communist Party. He used the VPN, got onto YouTube and started commenting on this guy's video. Then he took those comments and he took the guy, this Taiwanese guy's video to his local police station, and they punished him, right, for using a VPN, even though he was, trying to support the Chinese Communist Party. And then he had to make an apology video, and he posted that up, and he got in trouble for that as well. So it's so funny how things work over there.
Yeah, strange. Now, I just wanted to talk about that change that's happened, let's say, in the last 10 years. Has that been like a general trend, like towards Xinjiang, for example, like the issues there? Yeah. So, for example, we saw like the mass protests. I think it was like 2009. Yeah, and then I was actually in China when they had the Kunming stabbings.
Stabbings. Yeah,
and it was very, very suspicious. Yeah. And but like we sort of saw things starting to happen there. Is that because of those key incidents, or is that a general Chinese policy? Was that, or maybe like a third one is that actually just like a Xi Jinping thing? Because we saw Xi Jinping come to power, and then like things seem to take a very drastic change on a whole range of different issues. especially, you know, like what's happening in East Turkestan.
Yeah, so people have to get it out of their mind. It's not a Xi Jinping thing.
It's not.
It's a broad Chinese Communist Party government thing. You know, the Uyghurs haven't just been persecuted under Xi Jinping. They've been under whether it be Mao Zedong, whether it be Deng Xiaoping, whether it be Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, all of them. They persecuted the Uyghurs in some way. So, for example, when we talk about forced labor, right now there's proper forced labor camps and all this. But before, slowly, they would offer, especially some of our young girls, 16, 17, 18, 19, to coerce them to move into the eastern side, like to work in factories, and they'd give them very low wages. But they'd come up to them, they'd sign them up, they'd be very nice about it. Now it's you're forced to go. So they do it very slowly. So back in the day, they would reward Uyghurs if they intermarried with Chinese people, right? They would give them the equivalent of $1,000 or $2,000. Now you're forced. If you don't, or if you refuse, then you are taken to a camp, meaning that there's something wrong with you. What's wrong if you marry a Chinese? Is there anything wrong with this? So they if you say, oh, it's against my religion, I'm supposed to marry a Muslim, blah blah blah. That means what China views. Yeah, you're religious. So they try to get anything religious. So today you're not allowed to be openly religious anymore. So things like, brother, stop smoking, brother. That's haram. You know, that statement in itself will get you into trouble. Assalamu alaikum. That's, you know, that's off. So anything with any religious inkling you have is, you know, will be stamped out, and you have to be what they call re-educated or re-educated to fit the Chinese standard, meaning to be assimilated in the society. So you may think, what's wrong with assimilation? Don't we have assimilation policies in Australia, right? We have assimilation, what we agree to, right? But China take it a step further. If we were to apply Chinese assimilation policy in Australia, it would mean that the Australian government would force everybody to speak English, force everybody to live the typical Australian lifestyle, and we can sort of guess what that is. Take your children away to be educated, you know, sort of what happened to the Aboriginals with the stolen generation, or exactly what happened to the Aboriginals with the stolen generation. So you've got that going on. So China says you have to be Chinese, speak Chinese, eat like us, talk like us, live like us, believe like us, worship like us, and then you'll be okay. And those that sort of resist that, you know, end up disappearing.
But isn't on like on another level, especially this like the whole Shaoshu or the minority like card that they like to play, don't they like to say like, oh, look at these Uyghur dances that they do and the fancy clothes that they wear? Isn't that like something that they value, or is that just very surface level?
That's very surface level. So right now, a lot of those performers are actually not Uyghur anymore. You'll see them as Chinese. And so we are seen in China is not the only one that's doing that. Like the Hitler would do this as well. They'd prop up, you know, a certain amount of Jews to say, look, the Uyghurs are here. We are preserving their language, their culture, their food. But now they are making it their own, saying this is ours. The land is ours. The language is ours. Everything is ours.
It's like Israel appropriating hummus, like saying,
yeah,
you know, it's
yeah.
Oh man. All right. I wanted to talk a little bit about history. So if you could give our viewers or listeners a quick overview of the history of the Uyghur people and you know the various Uyghur states that there were, and sort of you know just like the last 200, 300 years.
Yeah. So you all would have heard of the Ottoman Empire. You know probably the longest Islamic empire, like especially the most recent. Then before that you had the Seljuk Empire. If everyone's seen Ertuğrul. So that sort of period. Yeah. Before that, you had the Sayyid Uyghur Empire. So the Uyghurs were the first Turkic group to establish an Islamic empire in the early 10th century under Sultan Sa'd Burahan. We were the first. And then that's how Islam was introduced to the Turks, essentially. And then you have this long history up until the 1920s.
And that's in the same region, in the Xinjiang, in like the East Turkestan area?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Okay. And then for centuries, there was years and years of sort of jihad, if you will, propagating the religion throughout what we call geographically as Turkestan. So throughout Kazakhstan, today Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, Iran, Turkey, and then continues all the way up to, say, Austria, if you will, you know, if you were to add everything together.
Would you say at that time that there was like a distinct, like, I suppose, like Uyghur identity, or was that sort of like merged with like what the Kazakhs are now and the Uzbeks and all of that? Is that like that sort of Central Asian region? Was that all merged together, or was that sort of very distinctly Uyghur as well?
Yeah, so I'm not a historian, but generally from what I've learned is that everyone back in the day, if you asked someone from that region who they were, they'd either answer you, I am Turk or I am Muslim. That's it. As to who they were. Later on, you can talk about the certain geopolitics that went on in the region with Russia and everyone being told, being taught nationalism and Fulan, you are Kazakh, you are Uzbek now, you are Kyrgyz now, you are Uyghur now. And then the Uyghurs essentially adapted to that as well. And then you had the nation states like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan today.
Okay.
And then
So it's basically a modern thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Uyghurs ended up embracing that they wanted to hold on to their sort of Turkish and Islamic roots. So they established the East Turkistan Islamic Republic in 1933,
Okay.
which was very short-lived.
So that's under the nationalist rule of China after the Qing.
So yes, after Qing, after the Qing dynasty, so that fell. Then you had the nationalist movement, and then
So there's a long period where the Uyghurs are actually under Qing Qing rule.
Yeah. So during the Manchu Empire under the Qing dynasty, this was around 18 in the late 1700s. We were given the name Xinjiang, and in 1887, we were fully under their control. There was 100 years of wars between the Uyghurs, and during the late 18th century period, and then. So you had all these wars in 1887 was a big time where they annexed Xinjiang into the Qing dynasty. And then the Uyghurs established the Islamic Republic, which was very short-lived. And then you had another sort of 10 years of war between the Chinese. And then with the help of Russia and, surprisingly, the communist part, the Chinese, we had established the East Turkestan Republic in the north, which is in Gulja. And then in 1955...
So just to be clear, the common enemy is it the nationalists or is it like local warlords?
Both.
Okay. Because as I understand from the nationalist period, especially in the frontier regions, the nationalists, they didn't really have proper control over things. It was just basically local warlords that were ruling, here and there.
But we generally, especially at that time, we don't see a difference between nationalists or the communists. And essentially in history, we died more under nationalist hands than communist hands.
Well, back then, you mean?
Yeah, back then. Yeah. Not today. Obviously, you can't. But many Uyghurs are nervous of the fact that, if sort of present day, the Taiwanese government was in control, and would there be any difference? And to us, it would be no. But right now, we're sort of working hand in hand against a common enemy. But we would the main goal is to sort of have an independent state, to live independent of any ruler besides, unless it was our own Uyghur ruler, so to speak. And then you had the second East Turkestan government from 1944 to 1949. The Chinese communists came in promising that we're going to be here for a while. We're going to sort of take care of you guys.
He's an autonomous state.
He's an autonomous state for you, because every time that the Chinese would come in, we would always want to have an independent state or gain independence. So they said, you don't stick to autonomy, and you can rule however you like, but you'll be under our guise. And that didn't happen. It was more murder, more. You had the Cultural Revolution, or the Great Leap Backwards, as I say, where millions died together with Uyghurs, millions of Chinese. We don't know the number. I think anywhere between 40, 50 million up to 100 million, some experts say. It's very hard to gauge. And so this is not new. So, for example, in the 80s, in the early 60s, they got rid of our language. So they went from, we had traditional Arabic scripts, sort of Ottoman scripts, right? But it was, you would read like in Uyghur by using Arabic letters, and they changed it to Latin around 1960, 61.
So who changed it though?
Like
Chinese wouldn't change it to Latin, right? Like,
what they did under their leadership, changed it to Latin, and then they changed it again 20 years later. So you had all the Uyghur people essentially become illiterate overnight, and then illiterate overnight a generation later again.
Wow.
Yeah. So you had Latin, and then it went back to the Arabic script in like 1980, 1981-ish, went back to Arabic script.
Do you think that's intentional?
Yes, it was intentional. It was the same thing. What happened with the Turks?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So to break that connection, and so after that, the Uyghurs smartened up and they started to learn both. So they use both of them just in case there's a regime change. But now China's like, no, we're going to use Chinese Mandarin, and even the Chinese themselves. Chinese used to use a very complicated traditional Chinese script, which Taiwan still uses today, and even they went to. Mao Zedong sort of wanted to revolutionize and upgrade the Chinese language and using a simplified. So anytime you open up your phone, it asks, do you want to read or use traditional Chinese or simplified Chinese?
Yeah.
And most of the people,
that's a little bit different because like basically they're mutually like you can, if you know one, you can sort of read the other. It's like they're similar. It's just simplified strokes and stuff like that. I wanted to sort of take a little bit of a side diversion. I suppose it's a little bit personal. So myself as a Hui, my grandfather, he's originally from Shandong, which is in like I suppose like northeast China. Hui from Shandong, but on my mother's side, they were very like allied with the nationalist government, and my grandfather, even though he was born in Shandong, he found himself raised in Xinjiang or in East Turkistan at that time, and found himself, obviously like probably there with us. I'm not exactly sure of the details, but they're in a political position. So he would have been with a nationalist or under whatever world lord there was at the time. And I've heard and read about some really I suppose disheartening relationships between the Hui and the Uyghur. Like it's sort of like I think there's like an Uyghur saying, if you have a Hui neighbor, then have an axe ready. And things like that, and that's for me. That's actually very, very frightening because like you guys are the same religion. Like how can you sort of have that much enmity to each other? Do you guys sort of have that? Like,
yes, Unfortunately, I learned that through the Uyghurs who came out of there. So I sort of have I had a different viewpoint. I still have a different viewpoint on things. Obviously, I believe that no matter what race you are, even if you are not just Hui, even if you're Chinese, if you're Muslim, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Everyone is a son of Adam, but I didn't realize how much backstabbing there was going on from the Hui Muslims. So it was especially during when we had the Islamic Republic, it was especially during those years that led to the collapse of that republic. So to this day, yes, there's a mutual sort of understanding now, but deep down there is like you guys backstabbed us. We're supposed to be of the same faith, and back and forth.
Sorry, just to add quickly, just kind of reminds me, because I'm Bangladeshi and there's a Bangladesh and Pakistan war that happened in 1971. That Bangladesh has gained the independence as a country. It's kind of you have those sentiments as well in that nationalistic front, in the sense that because Pakistan were committing genocide, for example, in Bangladesh, and naturally those tensions arise, even though we're in the same faith, same religion. But we tend to we have that kind of culture where we look down on Pakistan. It's like, oh, you guys betrayed us, you guys let us down, you killed our families, etc. So that sometimes gets in the way of the religion. So it becomes complicated to navigate those sort of terrains. So I see the echoes of that in the conversation.
It's just history repeats itself, I suppose. Lessons to be learned, really. And like for a long time, just as like a Hui and in the Hui communities, obviously like I suppose like the more religious of us, obviously we sympathize with our Uyghur brothers and sisters, but there was always this sort of like, they're being very provocative by saying East Turkestan. That these guys are, why don't they just assimilate like we did? They sort of had that attitude, and I felt that was actually very negative towards them. And I suppose it's only been in the last few years where, I suppose the Hui community have felt more and more pressure from the Chinese government, because we just for everyone's background, the Hui community are basically the ideal assimilated Muslim community. So we're like, basically we're Han in terms of our language, in terms of our look, in terms of our food, mostly, except that we're Muslims. And because like there's all these deals where, we sort of practice the Chinese communist sanctified version of Islam, then, we are sort of given freedoms that they're not given to the Uyghur brothers and sisters. So we're like, look at that, it's a perfect example, like you have assimilated, Muslims in Australia, and they're sort of like paraded, and, look at these these sisters wearing Australia Day hijabs and yeah, but like in China, we sort of had that sentiment, but then recently, we've had Hui Mosque being demolished.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of the Islamic schools that we've had targeted, and really, it's been just I suppose lesson again.
Yeah.
You can't just sort of create these divisions between the Muslims. It's like it really needs to be something where we unite, because we're all in it together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're supposed to unite, holding tight onto the rope of Allah, and it's examples exactly like that. So showing that at the end of the day, they do see you as Muslim. At the end of the day, they do see us as the ones that say La ilaha illallah, and now we're sort of common. And so a lot of, as you mentioned, the mosque demolitions, a lot of the videos are coming actually from Hui Muslim areas, and they're complaining and they're fighting, and
Yeah. I wanted to ask with respect to, I suppose one of the criticism, and this is a criticism I suppose that like the Hui community has, is that the Uyghurs, like obviously you had this sense of independence, and it's very clear from your history that you're proud of it. You guys have a separate identity, that you're sort of exaggerating like the things that are happening there, and saying like, this is bop up the numbers a bit, add a few million, sort of dramatize the stories, what how do we sort of like respond to these concerns? Because that's it's not just, I suppose, from like the Hui community, it's like a general, I suppose, criticism that like, we can't independently verify any of these things, so we're just trusting a few witnesses, and we've got these vague, shady estimates. So like how do we sort of respond to these sort of criticisms?
So one, we have to ask the question, why can't we verify these things? That's the main question, right? I always like to bring in the example of Iran, right? Does Iran have a nuclear program or not?
Yeah.
How do we know?
Because people have seen it.
Yeah, because the world goes, Iran, don't build nuclear bombs. They go, okay, you know what? We're going to check. You're going to let us in and check that you're not building any nuclear bombs. So we're going to put all these cameras. You're going to sign this deal. And then we're going to stop sanctioning you, right? They go in and check. And then once Europe, Australia, America, they're happy, they go, all right, open up the floodgates. We'll give you this much money to feed your poor and everything. China doesn't do that. You've seen how journalists are treated. I, Arslan Hidayat, would love to be proved wrong. Prove me wrong, make me a total liar. Open up your doors. Let people in. Every time, I'm sure you've seen it, every time journalists, independent investigators want to go in, what happens?
They're followed.
Why are you following? Let them do their thing. People disappear every time they talk to a journalist. If they have nothing to hide, then what's wrong? It's essentially like, imagine, right? Yeah. For an example, right? This is my brother. Yeah. Imagine, I stab him, and then there's a big shout and scream. The neighbors hear him, right, and he dies, right? Obviously, the neighbors are gonna call the cops and see what's happening, and then imagine the cops come, and then I open the door. It's like, oh, we heard a scream. Can we come in? No. Can you come back 6 months later or a year later? And then imagine the cops say, yeah, by that time I would have taken care of his body, and that's sort of what happened with COVID. So what we're saying is, if every time China lets anybody in, they clean up the crime scene, they put on an act. I'm sure you've seen those camps or those vocational schools where everyone's dancing and nice.
Yeah, the BBC documentary, that was like the viral one, yeah. It was like, you can tell like they're being followed, and then they have this show, and then I think what they try to do, the BBC, is like they try to get other kind of clues, like what's going on and different messages on the walls, and people like leaving stuff behind in terms of the torture, but they only had access to certain things, which is like the dancing that you just mentioned and stuff like that.
So what they do is they have to end up cleaning up all the dead bodies and these abortion clinics, and then people are invited into certain areas. They're put on tours. So if suddenly we're in Australia, right? If suddenly we made the claim Australia's committing genocide, Australia will come, everyone, BBC, CNN, everyone come, visit. Where's the genocide? You know what I mean? Because Australia's got nothing to hide. So China, why don't you just let people in and prove us wrong? Is what we got to say. That's the answer to that.
But let's play the devil's advocate a bit, and let's say that this is basically a US or Western propaganda war against China. So China doesn't trust these journalists, doesn't trust, because they're going to spin it whatever way against China. Isn't that valid that China sort of has has its own sort of policies and does what it wants. Because America's the enemy, we shouldn't.
Well, don't send Western journalists in. Send Eastern journalists. Same thing. Eastern journalists are put on tours as well.
Yeah, like Malaysian and Indonesians.
Yeah, send the United Nations in. You're blocking the internet for what? People using VPNs and they're charged with terrorism. Why? You don't give Uyghurs their passports to leave or to go. Why? And why do journalists need minders? For what? For example, in Australia, in America, we have our own problems here.
Yeah.
In Australia, America, Black Lives Matter. In Australia, you got your own issues with certain things. You're allowed to report on those negative things that are happening in our own countries today. I can say, I'm not going to say it, but if I wanted, I could say whatever. I could say bad things about the Prime Minister and do whatever I want. And I'm not going to worry about the police coming to my door, right? If you just say Xi Jinping looks like Winnie the Pooh, this is the level we're talking about, dude. That's what you're dealing with. Forget Xi Jinping is a terrorist, he's a killer. No, that's death sentence. But even with that,
I've heard, I need to verify this, but even in UNSW, because a lot of Chinese students and stuff are there. There's Chinese spies around that's just monitoring if anyone says anything against the people in power and stuff.
Yeah, so people especially if you're a uni student, there is things called the Confucius Institute or student and scholars unions, right? They are not sort of cultural hubs. They are funded, they are protected, they are used by the Chinese government to spy on Chinese students. So you would have heard anytime there's any sort of political activity going on, posters, anything to do with Hong Kong, Uyghurs, Tibetans in universities, any Chinese students involved, they are threatened by the Chinese consulate. Their parents are threatened at home. They get a call from their parents or video called together with an agent by their side. And so even Chinese students who have come to the West to sort of speak freely are sort of still living in China technically, because those Chinese students are spies, and these Chinese students bring millions and millions of, if not hundreds of millions of dollars each year because they're paying for the tuition.
Well, so I studied in China for a bit in a Chinese university, and it was very strange, the practices obviously there that it was completely normal. But you had to submit 2 copies of every single bit of homework and essay that you did. So 1 copy was for the teacher and 1 copy was for the Communist Party to put in your record.
Oh wow!
So, yeah. So it sort of shows that, and this is not people that are suspicious. Oh, you have to give a copy to the Communist Party. This is everyone. Yeah. Just so that they can keep it on your record, and it's been I suppose become popular now or known that they have this social credit score system. Yeah. So obviously, China's not going to allow people to be off the social credit score system when they can't go overseas. They're going to have some sort of way of tracking, and so definitely there's a lot of action happening. It's sort of actually what actually happened when I was there in university is that there are a lot of students that obviously want to be part of the Communist Party. So that they're these are the guys that are dobbing on everyone else, and so I'm 100% sure that each university has their own quota of Communist Party members or Communist Party. It's just probably something that they voluntarily donate their time for, just to get better credit scores and so forth.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a unique country and I guess the people in charge when it comes to all this stuff. Do you think does any other country match in terms of, I guess, how authoritative or authoritarian China is, or not really? Would you say in terms of just how it's operating, in the manner you guys have described?
I would say no, because I'm not aware of anyone that is able to control social media in the way China does.
Yeah.
So basically, that's a key thing, right? So now we have encrypted apps and things like that.
Yeah.
Basically over there, everyone knows that anything that you post on Weixin or Weibo, that's on your record, and that you will be held accountable for what you say. But over here, we don't really get that sort of vibe. And fair enough. I actually had a Chinese student over there tell me here we know the government's spying on us, but over there, you guys are tricked. The government's actually spying on you, but you guys don't know it, or you guys think that they're not spying on you, but they are.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you guys reckon the government spies on us?
Like in Australian government.
Yeah.
So this is like interesting because like you guys were talking about in terms of, you know, the Uyghurs and their own state, and I guess essentially like in China in of itself, like there's mosques being demolished and all that sort of thing. I guess like that's pretty much like a really bad situation, obviously. But in the sense of like the lead up to it, how I think you guys were articulating that essentially like, you know, the cameras were there, they were being spied, etc. But I think like for us, it's like to that degree, obviously not to the degree it is in China, that, you know, steps can be taken in terms of the degrees of lens, because we know in Sydney specific, like in our specific context, like there were, you know, police spying in mosques. There were people like pretending to be Muslim, or even Muslims themselves, like Uncle Toms basically, in behalf of the police going into the mosque. And, you know, if they think something is a bit extremist or Islamophobic, then they'll report it. And so like those sentiments definitely exist all around the world as well. But yeah, obviously in the case specifically in China situation, it's a, you know, extreme situation in that sense. So like we do have it to some degree, and it does exist, unfortunately, because of, you know, the rapid Islamophobia, or like the state and how it wants to, you know, control things and ideology. You know, it's battle of ideas in that sense. So yeah.
Yeah, but you also got to imagine that it could happen in places like Australia. You know what I mean? That's why we've got to stand up to what's happening in China. I'm sure even not necessarily tyrannical regimes, even just some of our democratic ones would love the power that Xi Jinping has. Right now, whoever thought that we'd be restricted to our homes and had LGAs and entering places with QR codes and this, well, it's pretty much that's what's happening in China. You know, hopefully it doesn't. That's why every time, you know, if it looks like we're starting to lose our freedom to raise your voice while you still can, because this slowly creeps up on you. And well, we've always said China, it doesn't just oppress, you know, the people within its own borders, but it's oppressed essentially people outside of it. It's oppressed the whole world. You know, they've essentially, whether or not you believe COVID-19 came out of a lab or not, the mere fact that they held it secret and allowed it to spread so far before they said it was human to human and all this. And you know, people ended up losing their lives, losing their livelihood. People started losing their mind. So we haven't really talked, we may get into it with the concentration camps. People were complaining of LGAs, which you should, right? But we went, like, I wasn't here, but people going crazy because they were cooped up in their homes. You were getting a government paycheck and you couldn't move 5 kilometers, but people lost their minds. Can you imagine people locked up in the millions in a cage where you've got something like this room, right? I'm in a room. How big is this room right now?
I don't know, maybe 7 meters by.
So imagine,
4 meters.
Yeah, 7 by 4, right? Imagine 20 people in this room, locked up, caged up. And in Australia, we should. I'm not saying Australians should complain, but Australians were complaining because they were getting, was it $750 a week?
Yeah, something like that.
And then they couldn't leave 5 kilometers in a radius. They had to be 1 hour outside, blah, blah, blah. I saw the news, right? Yeah. And people around the world were hashtagging Free Australia and protesting in front of the Australian embassy around the world saying Free Australians. Subhanallah.
Yeah. Just with respect to the concentration camps, I want to particularly talk about Adrian Zenz, because he's like a very, very key name that always comes up, like from both sides, and he's basically a source of criticism. They say like, all right, so all of these reports basically they all go back to Adrian, and you know, China has a lot of criticism on him, and there's been a lot of attacks. What do we sort of gauge, like how? Where did he come from? Like, why is there this random name that somehow in every report?
One, China have not criticized him. I mean, they've criticized him on a personal level. They've attacked him, but they haven't been able to attack his reports at all. They haven't been able to prove otherwise, because all of the evidence that he provides, the main source is from Chinese sourced, from their own websites. He gets their statistics, their data, and explains it. And that's how he was able to prove the sterilizations, the reversed birth rates, because those were all Chinese stats. And so what did they do? They attack his personality, they attack him. I'm not sure fully of his background and where he came from, but a good 90%, if not more of his work, came from using Chinese data and using the leaked files that were coming out, because we believe that there are fractions within the Chinese Communist Party that want power. So we believe those high-up officials were leaking out documents and their own public documents that were on their own websites, not necessarily leaked, and now are unavailable.
Yeah.
They blocked those sites. So that's why they attacked. They called him a fundamentalist Christian, that it was his God. You know, it was sort of his jihad against China, blah, blah, blah. So, subhanAllah. Yeah. They only attacked him on a personal level.
Yeah. When I see that, actually, I see the parallel between that and what I suppose like the enemies of Islam do to Abu Hurairah. So Abu Hurairah basically narrated, a very, very large portion of the hadith corpus. And so they attack Abu Hurairah and they attack his personality. Yeah. They attack, this guy was a liar and he this and this and this. And by discrediting him, they want to discredit everything. Yeah. So yeah, very interesting that sort of has been there in the with respect to like all of these.
And it's not a new thing. China has done it. Forget Uyghurs. They do this to everyone that goes against the Chinese Communist Party. They don't attack the work that they've done or what they've been through. They say, for example, our concentration camp detainees. A lot of them were raped and they went through all this. And then the foreign ministry literally hold up their pictures saying these people are essentially sluts and whores, and this was their lifestyle, and they've got documentation of what happened to them, how the uterus was removed and all these things, and they just attack them on a personal level. And this is a very common thing in Chinese politics. Can you imagine like an Australian politician, like some Australian accuses the Australian politician or government of something, and they go, oh, Fulan is this? You can't, like, the way that they do their diplomacy is very strange. It's like, yeah.
Sorry, I was thinking about the Abu Hurairah whose example. Like, we know, like, he was like part of the Ahl Sufa. We know, like, the character and the wisdom and the type of person he was, subhanAllah. And so, like, people like criticizing him and his character and try to discredit him, and then you sort of see it in the sense of how you described it, in terms of people are trying to speak out and get all the facts on the tables, and then people, and even like obviously the government in charge are going after him. Subhanallah, like it's like distorting. So like in academia, they talk about in terms of how to, like, truth and facts, like the differentiation between the two, in the sense that you can build a narrative using facts, which is a false version of reality, right? And so you can warp the facts into, like, for example, when you have Islamophobes attack Islam, they'll go to a quote in the Quran, and then kind of say, look how Islam is so savagery and barbaric, etc. It's like a fact they may latch into in turn, and then create a narrative around that, right? Yeah, which is essentially false. Like, it's a false depiction of things, whereas we know for ourselves, when you delve into Islam, properly and in nuanced manner, we know the truth and how it, looks like in that sense. So then, when it comes to like these political discussions, when it comes to, China and all these facts, you see like these camps where it's like, they latch onto these facts and try to portray someone in a certain way, subhanAllah, like it's always important to understand, like, to the whole narrative and the holistic perspective of these kind of discussions as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to ask a personal question, Arslan, because you're mentioning, like, I suppose, people that speak out being completely attacked by the CCP. Like, have you basically personally been, I don't know, like at the receiving end of like?
Yeah. Not necessarily from a diplomatic level. It's very strange. All the diplomats have blocked me, even though I never sort of tweeted at them or tagged them or anything, so they are aware of me. But generally, I
just wanted to add, do you think it's because like they have like some system or software, like they pick up I don't know, keywords of someone who tweets a lot of things, and they
perhaps or
but Arslan's pretty high profile. He's not just like a random guy that posts the little
things. I know that, but I know, mashallah, it's got the followings.
So,
but in terms of I don't know, like, because it would have to be a lot of ministers. I don't know if they're like always checking Twitter and then all the activists.
So but I do constantly get attacked by what we call CCP shills. They're essentially not necessarily white people, like Westerners who live in China, who propagate for China, for the CCP. So they're on YouTube, which is illegal in China. They're on Twitter, which is illegal in China. So they are able to use Western social media to promote. So they'll.
You think they actually will get paid? Like,
Hell yeah. Yeah. They are invited to CGTN. They are invited to all the state-run media programs. They are invited and put on tour to visit on these Xinjiang tours and visit this. They label, oh look, here's this genocide, and there's like dancing Uyghurs in Chinese. So they try to basically say that, look, we've come here, we've turned every stone, which they haven't. They only go to the most touristy areas. They don't go to the areas that have been found via satellite imagery. And another way that they found it was crazy is, when you think China, you think censorship, right?
Okay. Yeah.
When it came to the camps, this is where Chinese censorship backfired. Because you know how they found most of the camps?
Yeah.
Because most of the camps were actually, if you go to the locations, right, they are whited out on Chinese version of Google Maps. So they have something called Beidou Maps,
Yeah, that's right.
which is like Chinese Google Maps, right? And you go into certain areas, and you just sort of go around, and then they white out these sensitive areas, or they white out certain areas. So what some journalists did from BuzzFeed, there's a report, if you go to BuzzFeed, hidden camps, hidden concentration camps or something, all the locations are there, all the coordinates. They took those coordinates that were whited out on the Chinese version of Google Maps, Beidou Maps. Then they went into Google Maps or Google Earth, and there they were, in plain sight. And very recently, I think it was probably not even half a year ago, there's a Chinese channel called Guan Guan. Did you see it?
Yeah, the I think it's like Taiwanese or something.
No, his channel, it says it's located in Taiwan, but he's a mainlander, right?
Okay.
And he's in New York right now. But his name is Guan Guan, if anyone wants to check it out. All small caps together, Guan. And he went to those locations. He got hold of the BuzzFeed article, and he went to those locations, and he took footage, on the ground footage of where those camps were. And he found like 18, 20 of them. And we say to those shills, why don't you go to those locations? Why don't you interview the people there? They won't be allowed to. And then suddenly they'll be like randomly interviewing a farm person. And then suddenly state-run media comes, and yeah.
I watched that video. I was actually a little bit disappointed that like he saw the camps and he had all the footage, and in some places it was really dramatic. It was like hiding over the mountain or whatever. But like the camps looked empty. Yeah. Is that, do you reckon this is because everyone's inside, or like it didn't look like there was action or anything?
From what we've heard of from concentration camp detainees, they spend most of their days inside. They said every few weeks or every month they went outside for an hour or something like this. Mainly they're inside, they're being tortured, they're being indoctrinated, they're being fed 400-500 calorie diets, they're being fed these, God knows what they're being fed, they're being injected with something, and these injections get everyone into a zombie-like state. They said they didn't feel anything, they knew they were alive, and that's it. They didn't have any aspiration, they were just there, and they were just they were used to the torture, it was just like,
aren't there like different levels of camps? So I heard like there's some camps where basically you go home at the end of the day, you just like go there to get your vocational training, and then go back home. So wouldn't there just be like buses shuttling people?
Yes. So those ones they do look like schools. So there are like 95 camps or 96 camps where you sort of still have to have people in society to teach the people or to propagate to people. Then every week they have flag raising ceremonies for 2-3 hours, and you have to there's an attendance book, and you have to meet a certain criteria for you to be ticked. And in that attendance book, there is also your Chinese relative information there, because all of each Uyghur is partnered with a Chinese relative, meaning if you're a male, you're partnered with a female Chinese Communist Party member, and they live with you essentially. They live with you for about 15 days of the month. They eat with you, they sleep with you, they learn with you, they dialogue with you, they record everything that you do. So you got that. Then you've got the concentration camp where it's an indoctrination camp where you go through the torture, where you go through all those horrible things that have been mentioned by the former concentration camp detainees. And before you go there, your DNA, your blood, your urine, everything is taken and it's stored in a database. And we believe that this is used for organ transplants, because they've got all the information on your organs, on your blood, how healthy you are. And we've heard from especially one doctor, an Anwar Tohti, in the mid-90s, and he would carry out, a Uyghur surgeon as well, he would carry out, what would happen is that they have public execution, or they have executions in China, and they would purposely shoot the person in the shoulder or have him half dead, and then they would quickly extract the organs from there. They have so many organs coming out of East Turkestan that in some airports, and you can find this on social media, they have express transfer lanes, especially for organs. It's written on the floor in the Uyghur and Chinese language in green, especially in Kashgar airport. So you're thinking, now in general, and I'm sure you may know this as well, generally Chinese people or even Uyghur people, we're not really up to date about, giving your organs, and it's not a thing that's really promoted or known. Like even recently, I signed up to be an organ donor on Medicare, right? You can sort of pick that. And I told my mom, she's like, what are you doing? That's crazy. It's not a normal thing. I was like, in the Quran, it says, if you save one life, it's like saving all of humanity. I know what the fatwa is, but I'm an organ donor technically. But it's not a big thing. So how can you're getting out so many organs that you need express lane? I've never seen an express lane in Sydney Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world. Have you seen one especially for organs in an airport? Not. And this is Kashgar. Kashgar is like a place bordering Afghanistan. At the airport there, they have express lanes. So God knows how many organs are being pumped out of the area.
That's probably like one of the freakiest things. Yeah. It's not just like they're killing them or they're torturing them. They're like actually taking advantage of their bodies and then putting them in other people's. Like.
Yeah. And then so after the concentration camp, then you got the ones that are educated. They go off into the forced labor camps. And apparently they are paid something, the equivalent of $20 or $30 a month, which basically gets them nothing. It's just a show on paper. And they are moving these workers, and it's literally on, what are the main job websites in Australia? Like Monster or
Seek.com.
Seek.com and that. So there you've got people like people saying, I can offer or I can move 1,000 workers from Xinjiang. They have been educated, they are clean. It's like they're moving cattle. Saying, if your factory needs 1,000 workers, 500 for this price, blah, blah, blah. It was all there. Obviously, they're gone now, but people were able to get the screenshots, translate those ads. It was all there in the open internet, in the open intranet, Chinese intranet that they have.
All right.
I want to ask a quick question. I know it might be a bit off topic, but sort of related to what you all discussing in terms of, like, for example, obviously, like the government is trying to paint this picture like, oh no, the Uyghurs, they're getting education, they're I don't know, they're dancing, all this sort of stuff. It's all fine, and so obviously that's not the real account of what's actually going on. And in that sense, I think just to take the parallels into our own context. Yeah. Because it reminded me of in Yasser Morsi's book Radical Skin Moderate Mass, he mentions that he has like a sort of critique of how I think there's a museum in Melbourne, like a Muslim museum. I forgot the Islamic something museum. Of
Islamic
Victoria.
museum.
Yeah, and he mentions like the critique in the sense that how there's all these pictures of I don't know, like Muslims that came to Australia at a young age, and the Afghan cameliers and all that sort of stuff. There's the first mosque in Australia, etc. Like. There's that sort of narrative that gets portrayed or painted is like, oh, look, essentially what's implied is like, oh, look, Australian Muslims, they're fine, they're all here, they're doing well, they're assimilated, this and that. There's that kind of narrative. But in actuality, like, I guess the critique is that you don't actually explore like the Islamophobia that, the rampant Islamophobia that we all experience from, for example, because there was actually like a post by Nazim Hussain. It was really funny that on Facebook, I don't know if you saw it, he was talking about his ASIO experience. Yeah, so like, you see the comments, all the white people, like non-Muslims, they're all like, oh my gosh, it actually happens. Like, it's such a shock because it's a different world. Whereas like me and my Muslim friends, we were just joking, like, we know like every second Muslim of our friends have had these like conversations with ASIO, right?
I think that's what I was saying before, like when that Chinese person was saying, like, in the West, people think that the government doesn't spy on them. They do, probably maybe not on their communities though. Like,
exactly, right. And even with Friendly Geordies, I don't know if you've heard of him locally. Like there was that whole situation. He got tied up with the police and I think one of the politicians, and people saw the video of how like bad the police like reacted towards him and how vicious they were, and they were all shocked, like, oh my gosh, that's not the Australia we stand for. It was really weird because it's like, oh, you're giving legitimacy when it's like a white non-Muslim sort of experiences where, it's an experience of the Muslims, especially I know like many, especially like Arab Muslims that have, encounters with the police. I know friends that, got handcuffed for like just crossing the road, etc.
Yeah.
So like, all this Islamophobia that we experience, especially on media, etc. Like, it's all there, it's all happening. We experience it day to day, but it's like not highlighted. It's it's sort of that perception, like, oh no, like they've assimilated world, they're all fine, and sorry, I know it's a bit of a tangent, but it's just to kind of take it back to the Uyghur situation in China, etc. There's that sort of narrative at play, right? In the sense, oh no, it's all good, it's all fine and dandy, etc. But there's shades of it kind of within around the world. You know what I mean? Something to be cognizant of as Muslims that we need to. Dispel obviously those narratives and really get to the heart of the truth of what's going on, etc. So,
I wanted to just talk a little bit about Australian politics and sort of the direction Australian politics has been taking with respect to China, because it's been very, very crazy. Like, I don't actually think they could be more provocative than they've been. Like, it's I don't think anyone's expected sort of the turns of events. Like the AUKUS, the submarine deals. Supposedly we had our government. He had his WeChat account like hijacked, and like that's it's unthinkable. And just sort of the rhetoric that's going through. Recently, the Peter Dutton accused Labour of basically being supported by China, and then they're going back and saying, no, we value national security and we're against China as well. And like, it's actually very, very strange. Now, just as an Uyghur activist, does that give you a lot of solace? Does that give you like a lot of like, we're sort of like scoring easy points, or is that sort of something that you take with a grain of salt? It's just like very superficial.
If they were doing this 5 years ago, then it was like, oh wow. But now it's everyone's on board, and even with the United States, more has to be done. So there are sanctions out there. There are laws being put in place, but again, it's not making China budge. We've given them the 2022 Winter Olympics. We're not. I gave the Iran example. We're not pushing them hard enough to make them buckle, so to speak. There's so much influence out there, and Australia is essentially, and we have to be honest. Just even looking in our recent history, Australia usually just follows whatever America's doing. Right, so whenever America decides to change its tune, Australia will follow. Yeah.
Okay. Now that sort of leads me to my next question. And I suppose you're based in the US now, and I suppose the US has sort of been the champion of Uyghur rights, and you've got the Uyghur World Congress in the US, and obviously like the Uyghur cause and things that are happening there is very, very convenient for the US. Right? Do you believe that it's a bit too convenient, and like the US are basically just taking advantage of it, and they'll actually just drop you guys when it's convenient, or do you reckon they actually will follow through?
Just add to that, because it's just convenient, right? With the politics, it just fits really nicely like a glove, and so it's almost like weaponizing any sort of issue to fit their overall agenda, essentially.
I mean, to say that the US is doing it, for the sake of Allah,
no, like
no, but I know what you mean.
The sake of like human rights, and
no, I don't think so. Obviously, we say thank you to the US, but right now we are living in a time in history where, and thank God that the Uyghur interest and the US interest has been aligned, and God knows how long that will last. And if the US throughout history, because to be honest, if we look throughout history, the Chinese Communist Party has become the Chinese Communist Party because of the US. I mean, they bombed the crap out of Japan, right? And China were able to, or the Chinese Communist Party were able to take over China that way. They put them into the World Trade. I mean, 1989. They sort of forgot about that. They thought, we're going to choose China over Russia. China's going to be this democratic liberal state. Slowly, let's give them time. They put them into the World Trade Organization. So essentially, America is as much to blame for what's happening to China as anyone else. But when we come to today, again, politics is at play. It's just like, who the biggest supporters of Palestine are in the world? Which country? China.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
It's all politics, bro. So we say, this is why I call out, like I say it as it is, right? This is why I always try to call out to Muslim countries and to Muslims and to go back to La ilaha illallah, support your brothers and sisters. Because at the end of the day, all this politics, all this rubbish, especially, with the Hui Muslims, with their history, and now they too being attacked. At the end of the day, everyone's got to hold tight to their own rope. Do you think China supports the Palestinians for the sake of Allah? You know what I mean? So it's all politics, bro. But we have to go back to, we will get help where we can, as much as we can, definitely. I mean, it'll be stupid for us, the Uyghurs, not to play politics as well. But, we Muslims have to go back to the Sunnah, go back to, helping our own brothers and sisters. And that's something that will lead, this should continue to Yawm al-Qiyamah. And it's very sad that we see, because of, Australia's or the US or Britain's poor history, especially during this century, that many Muslims are not buying into it because of what they have done. So whenever I post something or I talk about China, underneath my post, all the trolls and even Westerners who are bought into CCP propaganda, oh, look what America did, look what Australia did, and it's true. But I've always said, like today, I criticize the West, but does that mean that what China's doing doesn't exist? You can't say, you can't criticize one, so I'm not allowed to criticize China anymore just because US does that. Yeah.
I've got a question to ask as well, because essentially it's a bit of a broad question, but in the sense that when it comes to activism and politics as well, and it's something that I've observed a lot. For example, in the context of Palestine situation, Israel. We know, like, a lot of mashallah, a lot of non-Muslims as well is rallying behind Palestinians and trying to raise awareness in those with those issues. But there's this kind of schism that happens as for example, when a practicing Muslim is in those spaces of activism, then you are sort of hand in hand with for example, a non-Muslim, right? And with a different set of values or belief systems. And essentially what happens is, like, and this is my personal experience in those spaces and from friends that are within those activist spaces, is that they're essentially having to, for example, deal with someone that actually at the bottom of it, at the base of it, is like adhering to secular liberal values, right? And so it's like, I don't know, the politics will end up being, I don't know, like Palestinians need to have their own sort of secular democracy, etc. Which is fine. Like, I guess it's for the Palestinian people to decide in terms of their own sort of rule. But I guess essentially as a Muslim, in that certain context, or Palestinian activists that I've talking to, they mentioned about the Khilafah and this sort of empowerment to Muslims and Islam within a rule within the political sphere. It's like that isn't sort of given any sort of weight, because it's like, no, but secular liberal values, etc. Right? So then there's always that schism, even though you're hand in hand with someone that is making the putting awareness in the sense that Israel are doing all these crimes. But it's like there's that sort of division on that political ideological front, and it becomes tricky to navigate those spaces, right? And I suspect a similar thing may have happened within, sort of, Uyghur sort of activism and all that sort of protests where, non-Muslims are also jumping on board. Like, I know, for example, locally in Sydney, when the Palestinian activism happened, there was like so many, mashallah, Muslims on the streets, saying Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah, like, top of their lungs, screaming it, the Shahada finger in the air. It's like, thousands of people, down the streets, which is great and all. But then I felt it was funny because I was reading some comment. It was like, oh no, what the non-Muslims will feel like sort of, don't belong here or something. I'm like, dude, like, why are you so concerned about how they feel, etc.? This is like our empowerment, etc. Right? But anyway, so like, I don't know, like, have you had sort of similar experiences or in that front in terms of?
So basically, you got to learn how to navigate or like censor. You do have to censor yourself, don't you? So especially we went out and said everything that we thought about we wouldn't be supported openly. So for example, like, you censor yourself depending on who you're talking to.
Isn't that an issue? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
it can be, but then you got to think about, well, where are you going to take this issue to? Because the Muslim countries don't listen to us, and when we do take it to say the Western countries, we take it to a human rights level. You know,
Yeah.
people are dying, humans are dying. We don't say Muslims are dying. We say humans are dying. Right. So this is sort of the
Makes sense, but it's a shame at the same time.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? But I get what you mean. Like, you know,
Yeah,
if they're
but
the organizations and the people that are
exactly.
willing to lend a helping hand, like you're not
Yeah.
gonna sort of, you know, just let that slide. You're gonna make use of it wherever you can.
Exactly. And you got to think about the countries and the governments that put us in this position, because we would rather, you know, hold to our own identity and work with, you know, essentially people or organizations or countries who are similar of either ethnically or religiously to us, who hold the same values. But unfortunately, the world doesn't work this way. So for example, especially you'll see this in where people, especially in Australia, when you're trying to open a mosque or Islamic school, you sort of make friends with other faiths that sort of went through that situation, whether it's a Jewish community or Catholic community, things like this. So yeah, you sort of have to. So right now, we are building a lot of ties with, especially a lot of Holocaust survivors and places like the Holocaust Museum, because they went through the same situation. And what's a topic that you avoid? You avoid talking about Israel. You know, so this. I mean, this is the politics of today. I don't know what's the fiqh or the fatwa on this, but this is what, like, we don't have the luxury of, like in Palestine, if people are calling for a secular liberal state or they want a khilafah, we literally want just close the camps. That's what we want for now, and then let's talk about other things. You know?
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah.
Just on the note of, I suppose, like Islamic revival, going back to Islamic values and so forth. Like, for example, in the Hui community, they're very secular in the sense that obviously the government doesn't support, you know, religious practice.
Yeah.
And I suppose like the Hui diaspora, because of that, are quite secular.
Yeah. Go.
Yeah. No, go ahead. And I suppose that in the same way, the Uyghur community, probably even more than the Hui community, because like you guys are targeted a lot more.
Yeah.
You guys, do you find yourself, like, you know, very secular? A lot of the religious teachings and understanding and maybe identity, I don't know, are taken away.
Yeah.
Do you sort of feel like there's maybe just amongst the Uyghur diaspora? Obviously, we can't talk about like in East Turkistan, but do you feel there's some sort of like Islamic revival?
Yes, especially when you compare like my mom's generation compared to now. This is why China especially attacks the people who are born in the 80s and 90s, because generally there was a bit more freedom than as opposed to Mao Zedong. And there's specifically a law saying one of the reasons people should be going to the camps is if they were born in the 80s and 90s. During that period,
They're more likely to be religious.
They're more likely to be religious, and that period, that generation didn't necessarily go through indoctrination. And during that period, they were more open to the West and all these things. So amongst Uyghur diaspora, the percentage of people who drink much less, the amount of people who practice much more. So yeah, that's a general trend. Yeah. And in general, like more respect towards the deen, because even say my mother's generation or people who were born in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they have a warped version of Islam, or very cultural version of Islam
it's
as
like,
well.
Oh, we don't eat pork, we marry Muslims, but that's about it.
That's about it. Yeah.
Maybe you go to the mosque on Eid day or something like that.
Yeah. And anything beyond that, even with the Uyghurs. Are deemed sort of extreme.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Like, why are you praying? Like,
or why do you like that beard doesn't look good on you? Things like this. Like you wouldn't normally say that, you know. Like, subhanallah.
I want to sort of end, I suppose, on a topic of activism.
Yeah.
So, just a few topics to talk about. Just the first with respect to, I suppose, the focus on this issue.
Yeah.
So whenever we talk about the Uyghur issue or East Turkestan, I find that we get a lot of criticism. Why don't you talk about Kashmir? Why don't you talk about Palestine? Why don't you talk about what's happening in Yemen? You guys must be like, you must be on Gulf money, and why don't you talk about these other issues? Like, why is that rhetoric dangerous? And how do you sort of like, I suppose, like, because in terms of like championing this cause, any airtime that you get on this issue is great, you know, putting it up there. How do you sort of balance that, like, in the sense that all these other places also need airtime and so forth.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't walk into a Chinese restaurant and go, well, why don't you guys sell Greek food? You know what I mean? So I'm labeled as a Uyghur activist. I work for a Uyghur organization. That's what you're going to get. And for those that say, why don't you talk about Kashmir? I have talking about Kashmir, Palestine, Rohingya. But obviously, my main focus is going to be the Uyghurs. I'm not against those things. And this is not just what happens within Islamic circles. This happens in all realms. Yeah. Like, someone could be talking about, certain rights for certain Black Lives Matter. Oh, how come you don't talk about climate change? Like, what's wrong with you? Like, well, we seem to live in that sort of world. You won't talk about this. But those who actually have been following me, when I'm talking about myself, I've talked about all those issues that they've mentioned. And so, yeah, we seem to generally just live in that world. Like when we made the video about the Olympics, why don't you talk about Kashmir? It's like, what? Like, what's wrong with these people? Like,
sorry, I have to call that up. That's the Pakistani army. Like,
yeah. That's right. Yeah,
Because it deserves calling out, really. Because like basically they've internalized the rhetoric that Pakistan's had because of their close relationship. China, I think Imran Khan, like last week, there was a joint statement.
He did the same thing. He did the same thing because when the reporter asks about China, well, why don't you guys talk about Kashmir? So all those trolls, he's the main troll essentially.
Yeah,
and they're just following his footsteps.
Yeah. I just wanted to actually point out that that's actually what Israel does. Yeah. Like whenever anyone criticizes Israel, like this is anti-Semitic. Why are you guys focusing on us? You should focus on all the other human rights abuses around the world. Yeah. So it's a. Yeah.
So Israel calls anti-Semitic. Whenever you criticize China, they say, oh, it's racist,
xenophobic.
Yeah, it's xenophobic. It's anti-Asian hate. We're like, we don't hate Asians. We don't hate Chinese people. We hate the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, which you've instilled upon the people.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about I think his name is Enes Kanter Freedom.
Enes Kanter, yeah.
So that's a very it's been a really big I suppose issue in the news.
Yeah.
What's happened, if you can?
So most recently, I only found out the news today that he was traded off to the Rockets, I believe, and then the Rockets team waived him. Essentially, they've essentially fired him.
Yeah.
So the Boston Celtics haven't fired him, and we knew this was sort of going to happen, wasn't it? The NBA, Hollywood in general, is really tied up in China. It was only a matter of time that this was going to happen to him. He was on talking about the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Tibet, Chinese people in general, Taiwan, and the Celtics games were not being shown to China. So all the revenue that the Celtics would have made, and they traded him off, and then the next team. So I personally think this was sort of a ploy. I mean, there's only it's been like 10 hours of the news so far. So God knows what else is going to unveil. But yeah, it was only a matter of time that this was going to happen. They're not going to let just one man lose millions and millions of dollars for a basketball team.
Basically, the same thing happened to Ozil. I think it was like a year or 2 years ago when he was in Arsenal, and then I think he just made one social media post.
Yeah, 1 or 2 tweets about Uyghurs, saying like Juma Mubarak, and then he wasn't played for a few games at least. Yeah. But Enes has been honored. He was saying that he was being supported by his team, and it's really interesting what's happened to him recently.
If anything, that just shows me how just talking about the issue hurts China. How they care so much about their public opinion that they're going to go to these efforts of getting rid of these high profile sports people that are speaking out, and it's such a I suppose if anything that just encourages us as activists and shows that activism actually does have some sort of impact. And I wanted to talk about basically what happened in the UK, the Stand for Uyghurs campaign in the UK. Just in terms of your community, how did you guys feel, or what was the sort of feedback that there was from your community from that sort of campaign?
First of all, we want to thank especially brother Sabur Ahmed. Sabur Ahmed reached out to me, I think it was 2 years ago. He found our channel Talk East Turkistan, and so essentially I've sort of educated him and guided him on the do's and don'ts when it comes to activism. Alhamdulillah. You got brother Sabur Ahmed, then you got brother Salman Bad from Islam 21C, and they coordinated that whole movement very professionally, and you've seen the cohesive effort. getting the scholars in, getting everyone involved, and it got to a stage where, subhanallah, if you sort of had a protest, say, against Israel, you'd get a lot of backlash from police. But the brothers were telling us like the police were guiding them and showing how where to go. It's this way. Like, do you guys need anything? I've always told Muslims, right? You know, generally we're sort of apprehensive to be part of political movements because we're getting a backlash from our own governments. No, this Uyghur movement, you'll be rewarded and you'll be supported for doing this, essentially. And so we, for the first time, we felt for the longest time that we were abandoned by the Muslim community. From that, you know...
And that's because of the Muslim governments and the stances that they take supporting China.
Yeah.
They don't even stay silent.
Yeah.
They actually go out and say, for example, you know, certain Gulf countries, we support MBS's fight.
Yeah.
Sorry. Again, MBS said, we support Xi Jinping's or China's fight against terrorism.
Yeah, yeah. And so you had like the Islamic chants, like, you know, tell the Uyghurs who we are, or tell the Chinese who we are, la ilaha illallah. And it's like, all right, so now for the first time in a long time, we have like Muslims coming out, and it wasn't from Western organizations or Jewish organizations or any. It was like 50 odd Muslim organizations coming together, putting on a protest, and that was really, really powerful. And all our media got on board, Radio Free Asia, and everyone. And it was good to know that we are broadly part of this ummah. We felt very connected again.
Yeah, so basically the Stand for Uyghurs Australia campaign is basically based off what happened in the UK. You know, we saw the excellent effort and how effective it was, and said, you know, we need to do this in Australia as well. Yeah. Like the political climate is ripe, right? Yeah. You know, if we don't do anything, we're sort of like cheating ourselves, and we need to do something because so basically what I suppose the current campaign is basically everything culminating in a protest. So we're aiming for a protest on March 20th. And I want to ask you, like, I suppose a veteran protester, do these protests actually do anything? Like, what's the point of going to a protest?
Your own local governments want to see if there is actually a presence or people in bodies that do support this cause, because you can have hashtags and you can go viral and all this, but once you get a physical presence, that's something different. And we've seen that with many other movements, which bring up changes in legislation. It influences people, and to show that number two, that there is a physical presence of people wanting to stop genocide, like stop a genocide. I mean, I can't believe we're talking about this, but people, we're supposed to be stopping the killing of innocent lives, right? So this is essentially what it is. The Stand for Uyghurs campaign, stop them being genocided. People have to come out in numbers to show that if people really do care about something, you'd give up an hour or 2 hours of your day to do this. Yeah.
All right. What are other things that we can do? So obviously, like a protest is something that, you know, is all nice and dandy. But what other ways can we actually help support the Uyghur cause? Like, for example, are there like other forms of activism that you guys would recommend? Are there charities that we could donate to? You know, how can we as an ummah or as a Muslim community, I suppose, champion the cause after a long period of basically ignoring you guys and letting you guys down?
Obviously, there is a spiritual element that we cannot ignore, making sincere dua to Allah in the important times, because inshallah, Allah will send down, His own malaika, His own soldiers, inshallah, to help us. Then you've got, writing to your own local MPs, state MPs, federal MPs, your representatives. This goes a long way. Then you've got donating to Uyghur organizations. You could donate to, the World Uyghur Congress. You can donate to my organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which has research-based, findings on what's been happening in the camps. You can, especially if you're in your university, find out if your university has a Confucius Institute, has a Students and Scholars Union. And call them out, see if their security cameras are Hikvision or Dahua or Huawei and things like this, and see if, especially if you're in the medical field, is there any medical technology being sent off to China who are taking part in organ harvesting. If you're in the political history fields, writing a paper on the Uyghur issue. If you're in Asian studies, things like this. So there are many things you could do. Social media is probably the easiest. Retweeting, sharing, making a small video, pictures, sending messages, giving moral support, and even just sitting down and doing your own research. 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, actually just finding out. And even if you're not on social media, talking to the people around you. You could be a student, give a presentation in school, 10 minutes, 5 minutes speech. We do all this, and then this should sort of, if we all work together, it should sort of go through to all parts of society. Yeah.
Yeah. And pretty much it is, the Holocaust that's going on at this point in time. Because people talk about I found in schools or in, settings of education, they talk about, look at the Jews and what happened to them. Obviously, it was really horrible and bad. And they act like as if, the world has progressed from that and we're a lot better. And it's not going to return to that. Like similarly how they talk about, for example, that's the reason why we have, secular liberal values is because, in the past, look at how horrendous, Christian rule was, etc. But really, it's like a false narrative, right? Essentially, all these, atrocities are still happening, unfortunately. And as, yourself, Mukhlis, articulated as well, it's about, giving, putting that awareness out and doing as much as we can from all fronts. And, to really, increase the visibility and in terms of people, supporting the cause and making, inshallah, an effect and a positive, effect in that sense. So, but appreciate your time. Jazakallah khair for your time on Boys in the Cave. And thank you, Mukhlis, for being, the co-host, primarily host today. But it was really, good conversation because I think as I talked to Mukhlis offline, in the sense that, it's important that, two people that are more versed in the situation issues really unpack it and, for listeners to kind of listen in and to gain, more of an insight in terms of from that lens. So thank you for your time. And inshallah, maybe in the future we'll do another episode and, we'll continue discussion. So from our listeners, so from our special guest, Arslan Hidayat, my co-host, Mukhlis, and myself, we wish you the best. And if you want to, check us out on our socials, we're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook as well, Boys in the Cave. Go on to our website and check us out there. We're on YouTube as well. Give us a subscribe to us there as well, and give us a 5-star rating on iTunes podcast as well. And you can subscribe to us in different platforms like Spotify as well, inshallah. So check us out, inshallah, and keep supporting us. I'm your host, Tanzim. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.